Disco as a Subculture, a critical presentation by Sangeeta Lachmaiya. Myself. Disco in the 70s was an increasingly practiced way of life in the US. Found in fashion, music, and art, it exuded coolness and freedom, birthed from the political tensions of the dominant culture from which it juxtaposed. Hebdige 1981 states that subcultures represent noise as opposed to sound, interference in the orderly sequence which leads from real events and phenomena to the representation in the media. In this presentation, we will explore the aesthetics and cultural context disco can be characterized by and how it became a place to foster a safe, inclusive environment for self-expression and liberation from conservatism. Disco celebrated a flamboyant and glamorous flair in its defining fashion traits. Men and women sporting soft metallic fabrics, loose-fitting silks, hot pants, flared pants, and platform shoes, breaking down traditional gender norms held by the dominant culture. Fashion celebrating the human form and flexibility to move and express itself. With disco music aesthetics heavily drawn from funk and soul, it incorporates a groove-based rhythmic style, prominent bass lines, syncopated four-on-the-floor beats, and call-and-response vocals. Technological advancements meant amplifiers could reach clear sound across larger areas, and mixing desk capability meant DJs could transition dance songs smoothly, bringing disco to accessible underground locations. Hamsley 2015 explores disco album covers, noting the connection between the sensual liberation, glamorous fashion, nightclub imagery, and futuristic fantasy themes of the decade, incorporated in each album cover design. Describing this Wild Cherry album as pure sex, but somehow not vulgar. Going on to describe Chic's album cover, the old-fashioned black and white feel of risque stood out. It looks like a murder scene in an Agatha Christie novel. Although the look and feel of disco album covers varied, contrast in composition was a consistent pattern. This reflected the political tensions at the time. Initially a revolution in itself, disco was a cultural response to social and political tensions held by the dominant culture. The dominant culture can be referred to as the silent majority, a term coined by political strategists just during the Nixon government to encompass a new kind of conservative populism, made up of Americans that tended to be of working middle-class white people tired of the turbulent 1960s political protests and hippie culture. The protests for human and environmental rights over the 1970s did, however, not subside. Instead, it encouraged subcultures such as disco to flourish underground. President Nixon's war against drugs campaign further marginalized people of color, those of whom were against the Vietnam War, the LGBTQIA+ community, and more. John Elchman, assistant to President Nixon for domestic affairs, once said, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." Although disco was birthed from the civil unrest of the late 1960s, when a more conservative government was voted in, it transcended across classes, a jarring contrast from the silent majority, who held a more patriarchal, hierarchical aesthetic. This, however, meant that disco celebration of liberation became popular fast and led to its eventual commodification. According to Thornton, commodification refers to the process of turning services, goods, ideas, or social relations into commodities that can be bought, sold, and or traded on marketplaces. Disco eventually became popular, and major record labels signed with artists such as the Bee Gees and Donna Summer, who was known as the Queen of Disco. These artists became commodification powerhouses, turning what was once an underground movement into mainstream media products. Although once known for its authority as an alternative safe haven for marginalized groups, it then became something to be marketed to the masses. Below is a timeline of key moments in US history that affected disco's rise and fall in popularity for context. 1960s Civil Rights Movement. The fight for racial equality laid the foundation for disco's inclusive culture, celebrating diversity. 1969, Nixon elected as president. Nixon's conservative agenda, including the war on drugs, marginalized certain communities, driving them towards disco for refuge. Again in 1969, the Stonewall riots occurred, sparking the LGBTQIA plus rights movement, which with disco clubs becoming safe spaces for self-expression. 1970s Vietnam War protests. Youth seeking escapism from political turmoil found their joy in the disco scene. 1970s women's liberation movement. Feminism influenced disco's embrace of gender fluidity and fashion freedom. Mid to 1970s mainstream success when disco growth became commodified. Despite commodification, disco remained a cultural refuge for marginalized groups. In 1971, war on drugs. So Nixon declares the war on drugs. Disco becomes a space of resistance for those targeted by Nixon's policies, especially LGBTQIA+ and people of color. 1979, Disco Demolition Night, a cultural backlash against disco's progressive ideals. Disco's decline in popularity was marked by Disco Demolition Night in 1979, where participants at a baseball game brought disco records and blew them up between baseball games on the night. This event became a symbol of cultural divide and is remembered as a turning point in both music and history, making the decline in disco from mainstream and the rise in rock and roll. Some might argue that the event was a reflection of the underlying homophobia, racism, and discomfort held by the dominant culture. In conclusion, disco's rise and fall reflected the political and social tensions across the decade, a subculture that represented freedom, disrupting dominant ideologies and resisting oppression. Although it has faded from the mainstream, its impact remains forever woven in music, fashion, and art to this day. Thank you very much for listening.